1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 13, if you want to turn there. As I was looking at this passage, the question that came to my mind is, what does effective Christian ministry look like? We live in a world today where there's a lot of different ministries. There's a lot of churches. There's a lot of parachurch organizations. There's a lot of missionaries. There's a lot of evangelists. There's a lot of people doing ministry in the world around us. We probably know many of these people ourselves. Unlike the time of the New Testament, we can look back at the time of the New Testament and know what God was using, what he was using powerfully to accomplish great things. We know that because we can read the Bible and see which people received the blessing of God in their ministry. But today it's not so simple, because how do we determine what an effective ministry looks like? We have all of these examples, but how do we know which ones of these ministries are doing it the way they should? How do we decide which ministries are model ministries, so to speak? Now, if you're not really interested in this question, let me put it to you like this. I'm asking the question, what should your ministry look like if you want to have a ministry? You want to go to the mission field. You want to pastor a church. You want to be an evangelist. I'm asking the question, how should you pattern your ministry? What should it look like? Because there's a million examples out there, but how can you know what your ministry should look like if it's going to be honoring to God? Or maybe you say, well, I'm not interested in having my own ministry, so this doesn't apply to me. No, I'm speaking to you also. How do you recognize a ministry that is healthy? If you give money to missions, if you're part of a church, if you pray for different people who are involved in ministries, you want to answer this question so that you can know how to use your resources effectively, so that you can know how to pray effectively, so that you can identify the ministries that are honoring God and that are doing things in the way that God blesses and honors. Today we're going to answer this question from 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. So if you're not there already, I'd ask you to turn there, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. And I, when I came to you, brothers, did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom. For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling. And my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Yet among the mature we do impart wisdom, although it is not a wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away. But we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory, which none of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But as it is written, what no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man imagined, what God has prepared for those who love him. These things God has revealed to us through the Spirit, for the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God. For who knows a person's thoughts except the spirit of that person, which is in him? So also no one comprehends the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we might understand the things freely given us by God. And we impart this in words not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual truths to those who are spiritual. There's three things I want us to look at today, and the first thing that I have to warn you before I tell you what those three things are is you're going to have to fasten your seatbelts because there's a lot here. The more that I dug into this passage, the more I was surprised by how complex, how intricate all of this is. There's a lot of theological questions to be addressed here, and I don't want us to get so deep into it that we lose the broad focus, but we do have to touch on a lot of things, so be ready for that. First of all, let's take just a moment to look at the setting of these verses in light of the church there in Corinth in chapter 1. Then we're going to just work through the text. Go through it verse by verse. See, what is the apostle even saying here? It sounds really neat, but what does it even mean? And then there is one principle in particular that we get from this passage that I want us to focus on. And this principle, it's summarized in chapter 2, verse 2, but it really flows throughout the entirety of this passage. So those are the three things we're going to be focusing on today. If you remember back to chapter 1, Paul has already dealt with some pretty big issues in the Corinthian church. First of all, there's this division between the church. There's these celebrity ministers. People are pointing to one person and say, I like his preaching. I like how he does it. I'm a follower of him. And I like how he does it. And so there's these divisions in the church where there shouldn't be divisions. They're identifying themselves by their favorite teacher as first and foremost, rather than by Jesus Christ. Paul responds to this. He says, I didn't come to make followers of Paul. I came to preach the gospel. That's what my passion is. And you're missing the point if you're trying to follow me. Focus on the gospel instead. And then he shows that the gospel of God, it's a foolish message to the world, but at the same time, it's the power of God. And so God chose these despised people of the world. And he chose them for a specific purpose, so that when everything comes to light, it will be seen that God's truth didn't need them. So God's using them despite themselves, not because of them. And so they're striving after all of these, they're trying to identify themselves with celebrity preachers. They're even seeking after knowledge and wisdom. They want to be sort of great people in the world. Even philosophy. These are the pet interests of the Corinthian church. They desire to be wise. And Paul even says, hey, we all possess knowledge. But knowledge puffs up. You're arrogant. So you're striving after wisdom, knowledge, but there's something more that you're missing. Remember, this is a church that's filled with nobodies. We saw this. We can see this in the book of Corinthians. He refers to them. He says, you're not the great people of the world. And they know this. They realize we're not the great people of the world. They're not wise according to the world's standards, but they long for wisdom. And it's not really clear why they long for wisdom. Maybe they want to get a name for themselves. Maybe they're tired of being the despised of the world. They're like, this is our opportunity. We'll become great people in Christianity. We'll become really knowledgeable and filled with all these great thoughts. And then people will think a little more of us. Maybe that's why. Well, Paul's going to give them God's view of wisdom, and he's already started into that in chapter 1. But in their wisdom, they're pursuing eloquent words, speeches that sound nice and appealing, and philosophy to supplement their Christian views. There's maybe you pick up a little bit of ashamedness of a Messiah who dies on a cross in a distant province in the Roman Empire on your behalf? Maybe. It's not far out there to think that might be a little bit in the back of their mind as they're pursuing this wisdom. And then finally, there's this concept. You pick it up maybe, not very clearly, but definitely you pick it up in 2 Corinthians, where Paul is having to justify his ministry to them and say, listen to me, because I'm really an apostle. You don't get a lot of that in 1 Corinthians, but there's an undercurrent there. And then 2 Corinthians, you get it a lot more clearly, where Paul is even having to defend himself to them so that they'll listen to him. Let's delve into the text now. And Paul is going to begin this section really by just working through reminding the people what he brought to them when they became Christians. When they followed the gospel, how did he present the gospel to them? Because they're so focused on, we've got to be very articulate in how we present the gospel. We've got to be very eloquent in our descriptions, in the way that we frame things, and we have to be very philosophical in our approach to what God does. And Paul says, I'm going to show you, I'm going to remind you how I did it. Okay? So pay attention. When I came to you, brothers, I did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom. And he refers to the testimony of God. It's what God testifies of. I'm just a messenger. God has testified already. And we know, by the way, that who does God testify about? He testifies about his Son, Jesus Christ. So God's made this testimony, and I came and I gave you the testimony of God. I'm just passing on what a witness already said. And my preaching wasn't marked by this grandiloquent speech, by these lofty ideas that would make the philosophers marvel and stare off into space with starry eyes as they think about it. That's not how I came and preached the gospel to you. For, as he says in verse 2, I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Now, when I was very, very young, I didn't understand this verse. And it's humorous, the degree to which I didn't understand it, but I was like, so what does this mean? I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. So did Paul try to not know where the grocery store was because the only thing that he wanted in his mind was the gospel of Jesus Christ? Is that what he's saying? Obviously not. But Paul wanted his single focus, the intensity of his message, to be focused on one thing, the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, he uses this term, Jesus Christ and him crucified, as synonymous with the gospel. At other times, he refers to the gospel. Here, he's saying Jesus Christ and him crucified to highlight the essence of what is the message of the gospel, Jesus Christ and him crucified. And he says, this was my single purpose. This is what I was focusing on. I wasn't focusing on anything else. We even have this fascinating and honestly difficult section in chapter 1, verse 17, where Paul says that he didn't even have a call to baptize people. Now, that doesn't make sense at first. I mean, baptism is in the Great Commission, okay? So Paul's saying, I'm focusing on the gospel. I'm not even focusing on baptism, which is a legitimate part of the Great Commission. Now, Paul wasn't against baptism. He even says, if the need arises, I baptize people. And there are a few people that he names. But his point is, I wasn't focused on baptism. Paul wasn't interested in being able to write back to the church in Antioch, we saw 47 baptisms this month. Praise God. I mean, that's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. But that wasn't the focus of Paul's ministry. His focus was Jesus Christ and him crucified. Verse 3, I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling. Now, what is Paul talking about here? This is the great apostle to the Gentiles. The one who goes and he preaches boldly to the Athenians. The one who goes into dangerous places and does frontline mission work. And yet he says that he was with weakness and fear and trembling. Well, I'll tell you what he's not saying here. And this might be surprising, but Paul isn't talking about the fear of God right here. Okay? That sounds really nice. I'd love to see this as referring to the fear of God, as if you say, I was just filled with the fear of God and I was trembling in the fear of God. But that's not what he's talking about here. He's saying, instead, when I came to you and I thought about the message that I had, this message that the world says is foolishness, and then I thought about myself and what I could do and my own lack of eloquence and my own inability to deliver this message to you, and then the greatness of the ministry that was like a great burden on me, to think that God himself has given this message to me to proclaim it to you, and then to think about all the opposition that would come against me, and this message that everyone thinks is foolishness, it was too much for me. I could hardly bear it. I was with you in weakness, and I was afraid. There was fear to the point of trembling. This was a lot that God's called me to do. When I think about the weakness of my flesh and how wise the world is, it's too much for me, too weighty for me. It made me tremble. Now, when I read these words of the apostle, that is encouragement for me. And I don't know about you, but I can remember times in my life where I'm going to go and tell the gospel to someone and I am trembling. I'm afraid to do it. There's a fear, a sense of I don't know, uncertainty out there. And so if you've ever felt that, don't feel this sense that, well, what's wrong with me? Don't feel that. Paul himself had this sense that the message is too weighty, he's too weak to do for this message what deserves to be done for it. He's not sufficient for these things. Now, this isn't saying go and fear man. This is different from saying fear man, but this is saying when you go out to tell people the gospel of Jesus Christ, it's okay to realize your weakness. It's okay to have this sense of fear, uncertainty. I'm not up for this. If it just depends on me, this is a complete failure before it even starts. And that's what Paul admits. But there's one thing about Paul that's different from us sometimes. Paul didn't let that stop him. He had those fears, he had those weaknesses, those tremblings, but he didn't say, well, I guess I can't do it. He doesn't throw up his hands in defeat. He masters those emotions and he keeps on doing it and he preaches the gospel. So if you're feeling those emotions in you, that's okay, but don't let them stop you. Still do it, nonetheless. But Paul does master these feelings, and in verse 4 he says, my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power. The word plausible here, it means convincing. It's persuasive language. And he's saying, my word, I didn't use all of these persuasive words to just reel you in to believe what I'm telling you to believe. I wasn't focused on this fine logic that just works everything out for you. So I'm lacking in wisdom of the world. I'm lacking in eloquent speech. I don't have the philosophy that the philosophers around you seem to have. But there is one thing that I do have. One thing that my gospel needs if it's going to succeed. And that is the Spirit and power. There's something more that I have that made up for everything that I lacked. I have the Spirit and power. Now, this doesn't necessarily refer to miracles. Paul did some miracles. We know that the early church was notable for the miracles that it did, raising people from the dead, healing people, just doing astonishing things that honestly all of us would look at and we would say, that is power. But even if those things did occasionally occur, that wasn't the majority of what Paul is talking about when he speaks of the Spirit and power. He's saying instead, there is God's Spirit. I would almost like to say a principle, but a principle sounds too impersonal, and we're speaking of the third person of the Trinity. The Spirit, this being who confirms my words. When I speak the gospel, when the gospel is proclaimed, the Spirit is there with power to do what human eloquence and words can never do. To absolutely break into the heart that refuses to be broken into. To convict, to exhort, to edify, to bring the full force of the gospel on someone's life to the point where they can't get around it. And that is what my Spirit, is what my preaching had. And that made up for any lack of ornamentation, any lack of philosophy or wisdom that I didn't have. The reason for this is found in verse 5, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. And we'll delve into this a little bit more later, but I just want to point out that Paul wasn't against eloquent speech. He wasn't against these different things, but he realized that these other things could detract from the message. People's faith can rest on a human foundation, and that's a dangerous thing. It's easy to confuse eloquence with the Spirit of God. You think, oh, I know when the Spirit of God is working. Well, Paul seems to have a different viewpoint. You can confuse the Spirit of God with human eloquence, with human presentation style. And those things can actually be substitutes for a real rock foundation of your faith. And I didn't want your faith to rest in the wisdom of men, but rather in the power of God. And not only that, but as we'll see in a little bit, if your faith rests on those things, it can always be overthrown by something of that sort that's greater. And we'll come back to that. Calvin says that about this biblical faith that rests on the power of God, this cannot be accomplished unless we are fully persuaded that God has spoken to us and that what we have believed is no mere contrivance of men. We're not going to have a faith that is as it should be until we are convinced that it's God and not man. So I'm just going to use this as an opportunity to raise the question, are you convinced that your faith is based on the Word of God? Are you convinced of the Word of God? If you have uncertainties in any area of your faith, if you have uncertainties about the foundations of the Bible or the Word of God, you're in a great place. You're in a great place because there's resources available to help you work through those things. If your faith has doubts, if you have some uncertainties, well, reach out to someone, to a mature Christian who can help you to work through these things. And I'm not saying that just because you have some uncertainty in some area that you're not a Christian. I'm not saying that. But I am saying you're in a good place to work through that, to be sure that your faith is built on the power of God itself. Then verses 6 through 13, we enter into a new section of this passage. Paul's going to give us a little more description of wisdom, because some people at this point might be saying, Paul, sounds like you don't like wisdom, do you? I don't know if you've ever met those people who their arguments sometimes are based on foolishness. Okay? If you've never met this sort of person, you probably don't even know what I'm talking about. But if you've ever met these sort of people, they're just saying, it doesn't sound logical, and that's why it's logical. Sometimes they'll even misinterpret sections of the Bible, like sections in 1 Corinthians, and they'll say, well, it's foolishness to the wise of the world. And then there's no logic behind it. Because, hey, it's foolish. If it had logic behind it, if it was reasonable, then it would sound wise to the people of the world, and then people would believe it, and then whatever. You get the point. If you've ever met people like that, people might accuse Paul at this point. You're like one of those people. No, Paul says, I'm not against wisdom. Among the mature, we do impart wisdom, although it is not a wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away. There's a lot of questions when we come to this section. And I want to give you my interpretation of this, but I also want to put out there a sense of there's a lot of disagreement on these sections. We see it right here in practically the first couple words, the mature. Who are the mature? There's a lot of uncertainty about the mature. Is he referring to a certain group of Christians or to all believers in general? I'm going to make the argument from that here in verse 6, where he refers to the mature, that he's actually speaking about a certain group of Christians. Okay, and I get this from several passages. First passage is 1 Corinthians 14:20, where he draws a distinction between children and the mature. Another passage, I think an even stronger proof here, is Ephesians chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. Once again, he draws a distinction between the children and the mature. He says, children are like those tossed around by different doctrines, but then we're aiming to become the mature. Okay? You may not agree with me. I don't think it's a huge point here, but as I studied, this is the view that I came to. He's talking about a certain group of Christians who have attained some maturity in the Christian faith. This doesn't make them a special class of people. It's just people who have attained a level of maturity in the Christian faith. And he says, among the mature, we do impart wisdom. What is this? What is this wisdom? I'm going to argue that this is Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Remember, that's the only thing Paul's focused on. So it's not like for the children we give Jesus Christ and Him crucified, and for the mature we give this greater doctrine that is secret and mysterious to you. No. We give Jesus Christ and Him crucified. That's the message. So what he's saying here then is, we preach one message, Jesus Christ and him crucified. But to the mature, to those who have attained a certain degree of understanding of the Christian faith, this is wisdom. Okay? You have not yet reached a level of maturity to see this. You're striving after the world's wisdom because you think this message of the cross isn't wise. You need to supplement it with wisdom. But if you had a certain degree further of maturity, you could see this for what it really is. Wisdom of God. It's the same message. It's not two different messages to two different categories of Christians. It's the same message, but certain people have gotten to the point where they understand it. It's a whole framework. It's not just certain disconnected facts. It's not just an unwise, foolish message. It is the wisdom of God. And if you're mature, you will recognize this because this is what we are imparting. Verse 7, but we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. There's a lot of questions here to work through. First question, well, look at the word secret. We impart a secret and hidden wisdom. The word secret there is exactly the same as mystery. We impart a mystery, hidden wisdom. So the first question is, what is a mystery? Hodge defines a mystery as the word mystery always means something into which men must be initiated, something undiscoverable by human reason. Whether its being undiscoverable arises from its lying in the future, or because hid in the unrevealed purposes of God, or from its own nature as beyond our comprehension, is not determined by the signification of the word, but is to be learned from the context. But in summary, you can't understand a mystery unless it's revealed to you, unless someone initiates you into this mystery. You'll never get it. You can study it all day long, but if someone else doesn't initiate you into the mystery, you will never get it. And Paul says, we impart a mystery, hidden wisdom of God. Now, just a couple weeks ago, we were at the G3 conference, and as I was listening there, one of the things that was said I felt gave a lot of clarity to this passage. One of the speakers was talking about how the Bible is like, it gives music to us. And as Christians, we recognize the music, and it's beautiful. And I would argue that if we take that same idea of music and apply it here to the mystery that God gives, it's like music to us. It's beautiful, it's glorious, we see it, we understand it. But then the speaker was making the point that the unchristian world, they're like people who are tone deaf. They can't hear it. It's not that it's not there. It's there, but they can't hear it. So we say, wow, the wisdom of God. Isn't it wonderful? They're like, what are you talking about? It's foolish. That makes no sense at all. Well, it's not because it doesn't make sense. It's not because it's not glorious and majestic and wise. It's because they don't have ears to hear it. Or another example that we could use, ultraviolet light. You've never seen ultraviolet light. But I want you to imagine another color. Can you imagine another color? I've tried in the past. I cannot physically imagine another color. I don't know what it would look like. And if you've ever tried to do it, you don't know what it looks like. But there is another color, scientists tell us. It's called ultraviolet light. And certain animals, certain insects, have the ability to see this color. Think of a rainbow, red, yellow, orange, green, blue, violet. I don't even know if I got them right. It's been a long time since I took science. But the point is, there would be another color after the violet. And we can't imagine it. It doesn't make sense to us. But certain animals and insects can. They see it every day. Now, the Christian is like the animal that sees ultraviolet light. We see it. It's there. It does exist, but the world that we live in doesn't have eyes that can even comprehend this. So we're speaking a hidden, secret message. And it's for our glory. Interesting contrast here. This wisdom that we have, it's for our glory. We're glorified. But the wisdom of this world, in verse 6, those who follow it, they're doomed to pass away. Interesting note there. He continues on and he says that none of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. They're tone deaf. They can't hear the music. They don't have eyes to see ultraviolet light. They don't have the ability in themselves to comprehend the wisdom of God here. Now the church, the Corinthian church, they're striving to be wise. They want to be known because of their knowledge. And Paul is turning everything on its head. He's completely turning around and turning upside down their whole idea of wisdom because they're trying to be wise like the world. And Paul says, if the world was really wise, they wouldn't have crucified Jesus Christ. The Romans, Pontius Pilate, the Jews, the Sanhedrin, the high priests, they wouldn't have done that if they were truly wise. Your degree of worldly wisdom has absolutely no positive correlation with whether you understand the wisdom of God. Because these are the men who were trained in philosophy, trained in wisdom, and they completely missed it. It didn't help them at all to see the wisdom of God. So, for us, application-wise, if you are aiming to be all scholarly and academic in your Christian life, if you really want to be wise, well, look around at the people that are already like that. Look around at the university professors. Look around at the philosophers of our age. And they don't get it. All in all, for the vast majority of them don't get the wisdom of God. There's even many scholars today, incredible scholars today, who have devoted their lives to the Bible, devoted their lives to the study of the early church, devoted their lives to religion or even Christianity, and they have nothing of the Spirit of God in them. They are completely sterile in their hearts. They do not have the good ground that Jesus spoke of in the parables. They know nothing of the reality of the gospel message, despite all of their learning and wisdom. Verse 9, but as it is written, what no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man imagined, what God has prepared for those who love him. It's a bit of a fragment. It doesn't really translate out grammatically very well because it's just a fragment of a sentence. It comes from Isaiah 64:4. We could spend a whole lot of time here dealing with why doesn't Paul quote the passage exactly? Why doesn't Paul's meaning of the passage seem to be the same meaning as there in Isaiah 64:4? We could deal with that. We're not going to get into all of it. I'm simply going to, if you want, you can ask me afterwards and we can discuss more of that. Basically, I would say Paul here is giving the rough idea of a passage. This passage comes to mind. He doesn't quote it exactly, but he gives the rough idea of a passage here. And then he takes out of it this glorious truth. Who knows the glorious blessings that God prepares for his people? That's the basic idea that you get from here. Who knows what God does that's wonderful for his people? We can't comprehend it. It's just incredible what God does for his people. Something glorious is in store for you and me. But there is one word in this verse that's very interesting to me. And particularly because it's not in the passage in Isaiah 64. And I think maybe not only is Paul following in this aspect some of the translators, but I think he's very intentional in wanting to follow the translators on this point. One word, he says, what God has prepared for those who love him. Now we're in a discussion about knowledge, wisdom, knowing things. And Paul doesn't say, who can imagine the glorious blessings that God has prepared for those who know him? He doesn't say that. The Corinthians are all about, I want to know. Paul says, to those who love him. And I think he's very purposeful in that. I think he's very intentional in pointing out, you can know a lot, but the glorious things are in store for those who love God. For those whose affections are where they should be with God. Verse 10, these things God has revealed to us through the Spirit, for the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God. Again, there's a lot of uncertainty. Some people would make the point that at this point, Paul is saying, as an apostle, God has revealed certain things to me through his Spirit. Okay, I have the Spirit knows what's in God, now I have the Spirit, I know what's in God, therefore as an apostle, I can proclaim to you certain truths, and you can accept them, and we can read about them for certain because Paul had the Spirit of God in a way that we don't. I like that thought. It sounds really good. I don't personally see this in the book of 1 Corinthians because I don't think that Paul here is trying to make a distinction and say, I have the Spirit of God, so listen to me. In just the next chapter, he talks about how we have the Spirit of God. So I don't think he's just saying, I have the Spirit of God. It is true. Paul had a greater measure of the Spirit of God that allowed him to understand further the great things of the Bible and therefore to write these things, and we can take it as inspired. But I don't think he's saying that this is just a passage on the fact that the Bible is inspired. What's he saying then? Is he saying that we each have a source of divine revelation in us that we can all have some extent of, I discerned this about God and now you have to listen to me? Absolutely not. That's not what he's saying. Instead, what he's saying is we have the apparatus that allows us to see the UV light. We have the ears that allow us to hear the music. We have the Spirit that allows us to recognize the wisdom of God. This is about us being able to see these things. They're revealed to us through the Spirit. Remember, you can't understand a mystery until it's initiated, and the Spirit initiates you into this mystery so that it is powerful to you. This Spirit searches everything. I take this to mean that he knows all aspects of God. Verse 11, for who knows a person's thoughts except the spirit of that person which is in him? So also no one comprehends the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. Hodge points out that the point here is the knowledge of the Spirit. He knows what is in God as we know what is in ourselves. It is not to be inferred from this that the Spirit of God bears, in other points, the same relation to God that our spirits do to us. But from this verse, we see that true Christians, they're drawn towards the truth. Okay, and I'm meaning this, we are taught of God in the same way that Paul talks about it in 1 Thessalonians 4:9. There's certain truths that we are taught of God by. And you know what? You can go to a church in a very distant place that doesn't even have the Bible, and there's still certain things like loving the brethren, for example. These are things that are good, that are true. We should teach them, but God's Spirit is bringing us to the truth of these things, the importance of these things, because we have this Spirit. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we might understand the things freely given to us by God. There's these two spirits. The Spirit of God, this active, animate being, and then there's what we could probably describe as a principle that controls the world in its thoughts and its thinking and its understanding of things. And there's these two different spirits. We don't have this Spirit, we have the Spirit of God. And we impart, now Paul is speaking from the behalf of apostles, he says, we impart this in words not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual truths to those who are spiritual. So Paul is summarizing and saying, the gospel is not aided by human eloquence and philosophy, but rather by the working of the Spirit on the inner man. Now, there was a lot in that passage, and I did want to have just a moment, though, to talk about what I feel is the principle that we should draw out of this, because we can understand the passage perfectly. But even if we understand the passage perfectly, if we don't draw out of it what God has for us in it, we're not doing what we should as we try to interpret the Word of God. I want to distill Paul's philosophy down to one principle or truth that we find throughout this whole section. I've already said that it's summarized in chapter 2, verse 2, but the principle or truth that Paul says is, the church needs only the simple gospel, the true wisdom confirmed by the Spirit. That's all. Now, just so that there's no misunderstanding, we've just spent a little bit of time in our first hour talking about different modern philosophies. So am I saying that we shouldn't do that because the only thing that we need is the gospel? Is that what I'm saying? No, I'm not saying that. We should understand how other people think. But really the question, though, is should we consider what an atheist thinks? Should we think about how a postmodern person views the world? Should we consider what secular humanism is? Are these things important? I would say that yes, and you actually see this with Paul himself. He says that he aimed to become all things to all people. So he does have an understanding of the cultures, the worldviews, the backgrounds of different people. And Paul even demonstrates throughout this letter of 1 Corinthians a very keen understanding of the audience that he's talking to. So Paul doesn't just discard it all, say, I don't want to know anything about what other people believe. I completely care about nothing except the gospel. But what you do have is Paul saying the message that I preach is the gospel. My message is not against postmodernism. My message is not against the Greek philosophers. My message is the gospel. This is the message. This is my passion. This is my focus. So I just want to clarify that we're not saying there's nothing that we should understand about other people and how they interact with us, but that's not the point. Now, when we say that the church needs only the simple gospel, what do we not mean? What do we not need, I should say? We don't need confidence. We already talked about this. If you feel confident when you go to preach the Word of God, when you go to share the gospel with someone who doesn't have it, there might be a problem. How do you approach evangelism? If you think that you need to be confident before you go out there, you don't understand what Paul understands. He goes out there in weakness and trembling and fear. You don't need confidence. The church doesn't need confidence. We don't have to feel like we've got this before we even start. We don't need ornamentation in the message that we provide. In other words, we don't need to feel like we have completely mastered how to present this message to other people. Now, you may not think that this is a big deal today. You may not think, oh, we don't have ornamentation today, do we, in the church? And if you look back through the history of the church, you'll see that this is very true, that has been a major problem of the church through the ages. For example, many of the churches in England in the 17th century, the messages that were proclaimed in there, they were described as ornate, eloquent, oratorical. They were filled with classical allusions. They were studded with lengthy quotations from Latin or Greek. Probably most of us wouldn't be able to understand them, perhaps. But this truth that the gospel doesn't need that, there were some people who recognized that. The Puritan Thomas Goodwin, he was once asked to preach the university sermon in Cambridge. Now, Mr. Goodwin, he had this incredible gift for eloquence. He was a wonderful speaker, and he could go up there and he could move you with his ability with words. And this was a great opportunity, and so he had prepared this beautiful message, ornate, eloquent message. He actually describes his master lust that he was always having to fight against was this desire to be known for his oratorical skill. And so he'd created this very beautiful message, this sermon, but suddenly on an instant, he was convicted by the Spirit that he was basing the message on his style rather than on the gospel. And as Martin Lloyd-Jones says, there followed a kind of intellectual suicide. He went through his whole message and he took out everything that would make it really beautiful and glorious to the listeners around him, because he didn't want them to focus on that. He only wanted to give the gospel simply so that every single person in the audience could understand it. Now, today we may not deal with sermons that contain Latin quotations, but there are still a lot of messages, a lot of preachers who focus on the style, not the content. And you hear this when we have a great deal of these jokes from the pulpit, and then you have these witty little phrases in the storytelling and the life principles. Now, I'm not saying that it's always bad to ever say something that's funny. I'm not saying that it's wrong to give stories. But they're filled with this froth, this eloquence, this ornamentation, but there is no essence to them. That is exactly what Paul is warning about. We also don't need another foundation, such as logic or emotion or credentials. Some ministries are based on logic. They go and they try to logic you into belief. When I go to work in the emergency room and someone's brought in and they're not breathing, I don't give them a lot of logic. Okay? I give them zaps of electricity, power. Power of God is what we need. Some ministries are built on emotions. You go and you listen to them and you get teary-eyed. And you feel starry-eyed. And you feel like you were really moved by it. But that's because they're appealing to your emotions. Some people believe things because their pastor, their rabbi, their priest told them that. They're appealing to the credentials. Well, I believe it because of this. Their foundation is in those things rather than the power of God. But here's the problem. We don't need those things. Because if your faith is based on logic, you might hear an argument that sounds more logical. If your faith is based on emotion, you might be in a meeting one day where you have more emotions towards something else. If your faith is based on credentials, someone with more credentials might come and tell you something that doesn't agree with what you already believe. And finally, we don't need worldly wisdom, scholars, seminary education, university degrees. These things don't advance the gospel. Again, don't misunderstand. These are tools. These can be good things, but God doesn't need you to have these things in order to preach the gospel through you. You don't have to feel like, well, I can't be used by God because I don't have these things. God doesn't need your master's degree or your 15 years of experience in order to build his church. What we do need, what the church needs, is the gospel. This phrase, Jesus Christ and him crucified, really sums up the person, Jesus Christ, and him crucified, the work of the gospel. The person and work of Jesus Christ is what we ought to put our focus on. And I'm so thankful that over the last number of months, this has become more and more dear to me. So I could have stood up here 9 months, a year, whenever ago, and would have said this, and I would have believed it, and it was true, but it wasn't true in the same way. And I'm very thankful that I'm recognizing more and more the centrality of this message. This is the heart of what Paul is preaching. This is the essence, the core of what he's doing. So look at the example of Paul. He doesn't even focus on baptisms, which are good. He doesn't focus on all these other things. He focuses on the gospel. Now, again, let me clarify. When Paul focuses on the gospel, that doesn't mean he disregards everything else. He's got a whole book of 1 Corinthians that deals with many minute subjects. But that's not where his focus is. They are important. They need to be talked about. Let's not forget about them. Let's deal with them. But they are not the focus of what we have to base our message on. So what is your passion? What is it when you meet another Christian that you most want to delve into? What topic do you want to find agreement on? What do you want to persuade people about? Is it Jesus Christ and him crucified? If not, then consider the apostles' great passion and pray for your passion to be aligned with his passion. Very last thing here is that we need the Spirit. We've already talked about we need the simple gospel, but interestingly, Paul doesn't only point to the simple gospel. He very intentionally points to the Spirit and his work. Now, this land is full of churches, and this may sound surprising to some of you. This land is full of churches that have the form of the gospel, its words, its message, but there's no life in it. There's no Spirit of God empowering in it. There's thousands of churches in our land with pastors who preach day in and day out to dry bones, but the Spirit never comes and quickens them and makes them alive. Paul doesn't say that he came simply with the gospel. We need the gospel, but we need more than the gospel. And I know that sounds really bad to say we need more than the gospel, but I'm saying it in the same way that Paul means it. We need the Spirit of God and the power of God if we're going to be the ministry that we ought to be. if we're going to follow the apostolic model. So I want to conclude with some questions for reflection. Do we have the gospel? Well, I'm very glad that I can say yes. But then another question. Each one of us needs to deal with this. Is our great passion the gospel? Or as Paul terms it, Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Is that our great passion? And then further, another question along with that. Do we have the Holy Spirit? Again, something that each one of us needs to wrestle with. Each one of us needs to think through. I want to have you consider, in the words of Martin Lloyd-Jones, he says, does our doctrine of the Holy Spirit and His work leave any room for revival, either in the individual or in the church? Or is it a doctrine which says that we have all received everything we can have of the Spirit? Does our doctrine allow for an outpouring of the Spirit, the gale of the Spirit coming upon us individually and collectively? The Spirit of God working in us. I hope that we'll take these questions, think through them as individuals.